Hi, I want to talk to you in this video about Confucius's ethics of social roles. I've talked separately about Confucius's conception of virtue and generally his conception of ethics as consisting of three independent questions. What kind of person should I be? What should I do? How do I decide? Here I want to focus on another aspect of Confucius's thought. It's something that comes out at the very beginning of the Analects. And it's a surprising beginning. We're used to works that start great philosophical traditions or great religious traditions with booming statements. Things like, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, or everyone by nature desires to know, or every art, every action, every inquiry aims at some good. We don't get anything like that here, as we'll see. The Analects starts in a very sort of homey way, kind of talking about things that are like, oh yeah, isn't it great to have friends coming from far away, and so on. And so it's surprising, but I think something very important is going on. A lot of scholars look at the beginning of the Analects, and they think this is just a bunch of random thoughts. They don't get what's going on. But I think there is a pattern to what's going on. And once we see that, we see a very important dimension of Confucius's ethical thought. Confucius is giving us an ethics of social roles. Now, not only in the sense that his conception of propriety is one that is a matter of behaving appropriately in a variety of social settings, but also in the following sense. There are different levels at which I interact with other people. And so the best way of explaining the general thought, I think, is to explain this in a simple diagram. For him, there are different circles, you might say, of moral evaluation and concern. Different norms or rules or principles are appropriate to these different levels. Different virtues are appropriate to them. And in addition to that, different ways of deciding and thinking about things are appropriate. So we start with the level of the self. Some of the most basic questions are questions of the self. Not only the question of what kind of person I ought to be, but how should I behave toward myself? How should I go about deciding what kind of person I ought to be? Crucial questions and crucial virtues occur at the level of the self. But then my own virtue is incubated among the people I'm closest to. And so there is a level of friends and of family that is also crucial. And it's important to realize that that level is actually itself two-dimensional. In relating to myself, it's really just me and myself. But when I think about friends and family, I realize some of those relationships are peer relationships. Me to my siblings, for example, or me to my friends. But others are more hierarchical relationships. The relationship between parent and child, or other kinds of relationships within varieties of organizations. The relationship between a boss and an employee, for example. And so some of those are, we might say, vertical relationships, and some of those are horizontal type relationships. Some of them are peer-to-peer, and other of them are really more hierarchical relationships. And then outside of that, well, there's the broad level of everyone else, strangers, or we could just say others, people in general, in other words. Confucius thinks those are all different kinds of social relationships. And so we have to adapt our answers to these questions. What kind of person to be, how to behave, and how to decide, to the various kinds of social relationships that we have. The rules I operate with when I'm dealing with friends or family members are different from the rules I use in dealing with strangers. And I treat myself differently yet. Now, some ethical theories say, look, I should get rid of these distinctions. I should be absolutely impartial. In fact, once I was asked to give a talk on Father's Day about what Western philosophers have had to say about fathers. And I said, I can't do it because the answer is nothing. They had essentially nothing to say about what might be special to any kind of family relationship, really. And so in Western philosophy, it's common to wipe all this out and just say it's a question of how we treat people, including ourselves, including other people, no matter what our relationship is. Confucius thinks that's a mistake. I, of course, treat family and friends, my parents, my children, differently from the way I treat strangers or mere acquaintances. And so the expectations are different, the obligations are different, the virtues are different. Let's think in more detail about how this goes. We can see, in general, different kinds of relationships here, and if we start reflecting on them, well, take a look at how the beginning of the Analects develops this theme. Here is the very first passage. The master said, "Isn't it pleasant to learn and apply what you've learned? Isn't it delightful to have friends coming from far away? Isn't he a person of complete virtue, who doesn't get angry that others don't recognize him?" Meaning don't appreciate him, don't realize anything about what makes this person unique. What's going on here? Well, those levels are being distinguished. So, isn't it pleasant to learn and apply what you've learned? That's something taking place within me. Isn't it delightful to have friends coming from far away? That's about that relationship between me and friends, people at the level of family and friends. And then, isn't he a person of complete virtue who doesn't get angry that others don't appreciate him? That's a matter of my relation to strangers, to mere acquaintances, to other people who may not really know me, who may not really appreciate the character strengths that I think I have. It continues in the same vein. One of his students, says, "Few filial and fraternal people like to offend their superiors, and nobody who doesn't like to offend superiors likes to stir up rebellion." Before we go on, let me point out that plays a crucial role in our diagram. Few filial and fraternal people. Those are two basic virtues at the level of friends and family. Filial piety is the relationship, or the virtue, characteristic of hierarchical relationships. My attitude toward my parents, toward other people who are in a superior position to me in a hierarchy, should be one of filial piety, of obedience, of respect, of basically allowing them to lead and following. On the other hand, they have an obligation too to nurture and protect the people below them in this hierarchy. Peer relationships, friend to friend or sibling to sibling, for example, are different. And there's a different virtue associated with that. That is fraternal submission. So when Yu talks about filial and fraternal people, he means people who have filial piety and fraternal submission. People who get both the vertical and the horizontal dimensions of their intimate relationships correct. So if we think of it that way, we can say, yes, the fundamental virtue for this one, the hierarchical one, is filial piety. For these peer-to-peer relationships, fraternal submission. I have mixed feelings about that translation because submission suggests complete deference in a way that seems incompatible with a peer-to-peer relationship. But he really means, look, you care about your friends in a way that's different and greater than the way you care about mere strangers. So you often submit, your friend wants to do this, you don't really want to do it, but you go along because that person's your friend. And so it doesn't mean complete submission in the sense of in all respects, but it does mean you often yield to the desires and interests of your friends. And filial piety, you respect the people above you, and you take care of the people below you in various kinds of hierarchies. Now the passage goes on. The superior person attends to the root of things. From the root grows the way. The Tao, that is to say, the proper way to live. So we pay attention to the root of things. And indeed, these, it seems to be implying, are the roots. Filial piety and fraternal submission. Why? I learned to become a good person in the context of my close friends and my family. In family relationships, with my parents, with my aunts and uncles and grandparents and so on, with my siblings, I learn how to behave toward other people when I'm very young. And then I develop friendships and I learn how to behave in connection with my friends. And only then do I start expanding my circle of concern and awareness to include other people, strangers, even people in distant parts of the globe. So I really have something like an incubator for virtue. Family, friends. This is really the root of things. And from that grows the right way to live and conceptions of virtue in general. So, filial piety, fraternal submission. Those are the roots of benevolence. Those are the roots of Ren. If we look at that passage from a different point of view, we can see the same hierarchy of levels operating here. What are we talking about when we talk about rebellion against superiors? Well, not only a violation of filial piety, relations to, well, in some cases our superiors here, but in some cases to just others in general. However, when we attend to the root of things, we're paying attention to the self ultimately, and This level is the root in a different sense. This is the root of benevolence, or virtue in general. We develop our virtues of the self toward others and toward our family and friends more broadly by incubating them, by learning them through interactions with family and friends. Let's look at the next passage. Zheng said, "Every day I examine myself on 3 points. Whether with others I may have been unfaithful, whether with friends I may have been untrustworthy, whether I may have failed to practice and master the instructions of my teacher." This is, again, something that reflects this hierarchy. Whether with others I may have been unfaithful, whether with friends I may have been untrustworthy, and then whether with respect to myself I might have failed to master and practice the instructions of my teacher. That's a question of something I do. Notice it's not just a question of my relation to my teacher, it's a question of me putting that into practice, mastering it, learning it, and getting it by heart. The passages continue. We jump to 7. Zixia said, "If someone turns from the love of beauty to a sincere love of virtue, something happening inside, notice. If he can serve his parents with all his strength, filial piety. If he can serve his prince with his life, relationship to others, if his words to friends are sincere." Now we get the horizontal aspect. Although people say he hasn't learned, I will certainly say that he has. Here we get the contrast between the level of others, the level of self, and then both the hierarchical, filial piety aspect of family and friends, but also the peer-to-peer horizontal fraternal submission part, outlined again in that passage. Finally, what's the point of all of this? Well, it's really that different virtues and different rules of behavior pertain to different relationships. What it is to be a good friend is different from what it is to be a good person in general. What it is to be a good son or a good father is different from what it is to be a good person in general. And ethics includes all of that. So it's not just a question of being a good person, period. It's also a question of being a good brother or sister, a good friend, a good son or daughter, a good mother or father, a good aunt or uncle, a good, citizen, a good employee, a good boss, a good whatever it is, whatever the social role you're playing is. There are different virtues appropriate to those roles. And so we are going to have to distinguish the virtues that are appropriate for people in general, toward strangers, toward others, from those that are special to friends and family, and then those that apply specifically to me, that really occur within me. Now, according to Confucius, although these develop out of my relationships with that level of family and friends, they are the root of benevolence in the sense that that's where it starts. In the end, all of it rests on the virtues of the self. Those are important because they develop me into the kind of person I ought to be and enable me to have the virtues of the self that I ought to have. If I'm not the right kind of person, I'm going to misjudge others. I'm going to misjudge situations. So friends and family are important for giving me the virtues I need. But then, really, when I think about the virtues I have toward others, toward friends and family, toward myself, the self is the one that's really critical. Because if I don't get that right, I'm not going to get anything else right. If I don't deal with myself the right way and correct my faults, have the right attitude about becoming the right kind of person internally, I'm going to misjudge my friends, misjudge my family, misjudge other people. I'm going to do the wrong thing and be the wrong kind of person, and in general have the wrong character traits toward other people. Other people in general, but also other people I have a specific relationship to. So in the end, yes, it's friends and family that develop virtues, but the most critical are the virtues of the self. All the other virtues follow from those. So we might have a picture that looks somewhat like this. Roughly what I've drawn on the board, different kinds of relationships here, both vertical and horizontal within that level of family and friends, and then going in all sorts of different directions toward other people, because there are many different kinds of relationships I have to people at the grocery store or to people in a variety of other social settings. In general, you might say, if we look at this picture of Confucius, there are 4 kinds of relationships. There are these vertical relationships of parent to child, child to parent, superior to subordinate within some kind of organization or hierarchy. There are horizontal relationships, like sibling to sibling or cousin to cousin, friend to friend, employee to co-worker, and so on. Then there are these, well, you might call them skew relationships, just relationships to acquaintances and strangers that don't have any specific character. And then there are what you might call communal relationships, the kind of relationship I have to myself. Confucius acts as if that's really it. I just have that kind of relationship to myself. But maybe there are other kinds of relationships that at least approximate that. Between spouse and spouse, for example, where it's really, we're all in this together. It's no question of what's mine and what's yours, it's just what's ours. Maybe there are communities with fully shared goals. Maybe there are partnerships in startup companies that are like this and so on, where it isn't a question of who's got what job and what is our exact relationship. We're working on this together. And that kind of relationship is important, and so maybe it goes beyond just the self to those kinds of very close, intimate relationships where we don't really draw boundaries. In any case, there is an anthropological theory that is popular right now that follows Confucius in holding exactly this. So this isn't just some ancient theory that you might say, well, yeah, we've surely moved way beyond this. It's not true. Actually, the best anthropological, sociological, psychological theory, not only of human relationships, but of how we really go about ethical thinking, has exactly these lines. It says there are precisely those four kinds of human relationships. And so here I've pictured Alan Page Fisk, who is the person who founded relationship regulation theory. He says there are really just four models we have of human relationships, and most of our social interaction gets generated from those. They are the basic psychological schemata that we use to construct and construe our relationships with other people and with ourselves. Now, he says something I think very interesting. This theory of these four kinds of relationships explains our social life as a process of, well, it's one involving those relationships, seeking those relationships, making them, sustaining them, repairing them, adjusting them, judging them, construing them, sanctioning them. That's really what most human interaction is about. And I think it's important to realize that for that very reason, this kind of theory ends up being complicated, because some of the hardest ethical questions are about beginning or changing or ending such relationships. If you've got a happy marriage, you might say, you don't worry a lot about the relationship within that marriage. But when you're trying to actually enter into such a relationship romantically, or if things go badly and you're ending it, or if there are fundamental changes that occur within it, that's when things get hard. And so often it's those changes, the repairing, the making, the seeking, the adjusting, the ending. All of those are the hardest questions, you might say, about these kinds of relationships. In this anthropological theory, there are four different models. There is a communal sharing model. That's the model that's appropriate at that level of self or other intimate relationships where there are no boundaries drawn. There are authority ranking relationships for those that are primarily vertical. There are equality matching relationships for those that are primarily peer-to-peer, horizontal. And then market pricing relationships, which are really just the ones to other people in general, to the mere acquaintances, to the strangers, to people apart from some more specific relationship. So here is Page's diagram of how this goes, a little different from our circles, but it really is the same as Confucius's picture. We've got communal relationships that have to do with communal sharing, like the kind of sharing I have with myself. They're based on just me or some very small group, typically, of people as equivalent and undifferentiated. There's no, this is mine, that's yours. There's no, this is your job, this is my job. Instead, we do these things together. So it's all for one, one for all, as with the three, or in this case, the four musketeers. There are the vertical relationships. He refers to them as authority ranking relationships, where there is a hierarchy, parent to child, grandparent to grandchild, or maybe boss to employee. And they're based on some kind of asymmetry, some kind of linear order or hierarchy. Some people are above, some people are below others, as in an organization chart within a business, for example. There are horizontal relationships where we've got equality matching, where we say, okay, friends should be roughly equal. Brothers, sisters should be treated equally. And in those horizontal relationships, we care a lot about equality. They're based on balances, correspondence, turn-taking, things like egalitarian justice, where people get the same thing, or at least the same opportunities. Reciprocity, and in general, trying to keep the relationship in balance as peer-to-peer at the same level of some organization chart, or in, for that matter, the same level of a family. And then there are just the other relationships, the relationships to strangers and acquaintances, that are governed, he says, by market pricing, where it's a question of proportionality. How much are you contributing? How much do you deserve in response? It's not really equality, it's a question of, well, how useful is this to me? In any case, that, he says, is what operates typically in the marketplace. Well, however you think all that goes, Confucius and that modern anthropological theory are saying there are, in effect, these 3 different levels and these 4 different kinds of human relationships. They generate different virtues. They generate different rules, different reasons, different sets of social expectations. And so they are the source of both motives and norms. I am often doing what I do in order to seek a relationship with someone, or end a relationship, or change it, or maintain it. I am trying to be a good friend, or a good parent, or a good son, or a good teacher, or a good customer, or whatever it happens to be. So all of these will have their own distinctive virtues, their own distinctive rules, their own distinctive reasons that are appropriate to thinking about things within that kind of relationship. Well, let's think some about what Confucius says about these various levels. The level of other people in general, the broad level that consists of virtues toward anyone, whoever they might be. We've talked in the video on Confucius on virtue about the 5 virtues of Ren, the basic ones, including seriousness, generosity, kindness, sincerity, and so on. However, the crucial thing here is that basic rule: what you don't want done to yourself, don't do to others. That practice is one we apply across all relationships, to other people in general, just like those 5 virtues of Ren. They apply to myself, they apply to friends and family, they apply to everyone as well. So the ones that apply, both virtues and the principles that we apply toward other people, they apply at all levels of this. They really are appropriate to strangers because they're appropriate to everyone. What's really distinctive are the more intimate levels, when I have a more specific relationship to family, or to myself, or to friends. That's where additional virtues and additional norms kick in. I've already mentioned the virtues that are critical within family and friend type relationships. Filial piety, for example, governing the vertical relationships, one of obedience, reverence, service to one's superiors, but also then concern, nurturing, protection for those who are one's subordinates in a structure. Fraternal submission is that governing horizontal relationships. Service, trustworthiness, faithfulness to one's equals. Those virtues are the roots of Ren, virtue in general. You learn to treat others, in other words, by learning how to interact with your family. And it's crucial that you have the right kind of upbringing, therefore. Confucius says, look, this is easy if you've got the kind of family and kind of friendships that promote virtue in you. On the other hand, you might have the kind of family, the kinds of friendships that actually are damaging to you. And that's not to say it becomes impossible for you to become virtuous, but it becomes a lot harder. You're going to have trouble. Doesn't make it impossible for you to become virtuous, but it does mean that that incubator of virtue, of building character strengths, isn't going to be of much help. And so you've got to really do it on your own. Now, you can still form relationships with friends and other people who are going to help you. And so it's not as if that's hopeless, but it is harder. Aristotle at one point says, developing habits from the beginning in the context of a family is important. It makes much difference. In fact, maybe all the difference. Confucius would say not all the difference, but it is at the root of this. And it's very difficult to get established if you don't have good roots. So he would say that makes the task of becoming the right kind of person more difficult. Now, when we think about the various levels here, there's another kind of question that arises, a question of potential conflict. After all, my obligations to family and friends might end up conflicting with my obligations to other people in general. My obligations to myself might end up conflicting with my obligations even to my family and friends, let alone to other people. So what do we do about such conflicts? Confucius doesn't answer that question in general, but he does consider an interesting case. The Duke of She told Confucius, "Some of us are upright. If our father had stolen a sheep, we'd bear witness to it." Confucius said, "In my country, the upright are different. The father conceals the misconduct of the son, and the son conceals the misconduct of the father. Uprightness is to be found in this." In other words, Confucius seems to be saying here that my obligations to family members, to my friends, to other people close to me, take precedence over my obligations to others. If somebody has stolen a sheep, well, I wouldn't turn them in. And so he thinks it's good not to turn them in. That is to say, it's more important to preserve those relationships and those obligations to friends and family members than it is to satisfy more general social obligations to other people. Is that right? Well, Confucius doesn't tell us how big the scope is. Is it just a question of stealing a sheep? Maybe, I don't know, a modern equivalent, maybe stealing a car? Suppose you find out that your father has committed murder or is planning a terrorist attack or doing a variety of other things that are much more serious misdoings. Would you still say my obligation is not to turn them in? I think it's a hard sort of question, and intuitively it feels to me as if we tend to think that if a crime is very, very serious, then actually it's the obligations to others that take precedence. If it's relatively minor, then we say it's the obligation to family and friends that takes precedence. Where we draw the line in between, I think that's a very difficult question. But it is a critical question if Confucius is right. Because when we think about this and think about the boundaries, we realize that all sorts of conflicts can arise. Sometimes my friends or my family expect me to do things that I really need for my own sake not to do. And it's not just that I don't want to do them, it's really that for my sake I shouldn't do them. And similarly, the obligations that my larger society or that strangers might place on me may conflict with obligations to my family members, to my parents, let's say, or to my children, or to my brothers or sisters, to my close friends. And so then I have to decide what to do about those conflicts. And it's going to be hard to make those decisions. So Confucius points out, look, those are real parts of the ethical life. Whether we like what Confucius says in response to the Duke or not, the fact is we've got to have some answer to that. And we've got to realize the questions of ethics are not all within the level of, for example, relations to others, or relations to family members and friends, or relations to myself. They are also across those levels. And all sorts of conflicts can arise that make ethical life really complicated. I've mentioned that the root of all of this, ultimately, is the self, the obligations and virtues of the self within those communal sharing relationships. The master said, "A scholar who is not serious will not be venerated. His learning will not be solid. Hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. Have no friends not equal to yourself. When you have faults, don't be afraid to abandon them." We can note that we have some differences of level here again. A scholar who is not serious, that's something that happens within the self. Faithfulness and sincerity are crucial virtues within the self. And remember, sincerity was one of our 5 big ones. So that is perhaps the most important virtue in Confucius, the most important at the level of the self. Then he says, here, have no friends not equal to yourself. In other words, you want to be not in situations of family and friends that are rather like The Simpsons that are going to make it harder for you to become the person you ought to be. You need friends who are going to help you be the person you want to be. Around some people, you are going to think, I like myself when I'm with this person. I think I'm becoming the person I ought to be when I'm with them. Other people, you realize, this is actually kind of destructive. Being around that person makes me a worse person. I don't like who I am around that person. Confucius says, pay attention to that. Be around the people who will help you become the kind of person you ought to be. And finally, and most crucially, when you have faults, don't be afraid to abandon them. It is hard to take a clear examination of yourself. And in fact, sincerity is not just a question of being sincere, honest, open with friends, with family, with other people. It is most crucially a question of being honest with yourself, avoiding self-deception, being able to take a hard look at yourself and saying, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Am I living the way I want to live? Or are there things about me or my life that need to be changed? I've got to examine that. And when I have faults, don't fear to abandon them. Change myself. Be willing to revolutionize who I am and the way I behave, because it's crucial that I put my focus on that kind of question. Say, what kind of person should I be? I've got to grow into that kind of person. Confucius says it's not a question of being born good or being born with the right kind of personality. You mold your own personality. You do it by putting yourself in various social relationships and situations, being around other people who form you into the kind of person you want to be. And it's a question of how you think. A huge amount of our lives is really spent in a kind of conversation mentally with ourselves. The shape of that conversation makes a crucial difference. So I have to think, do I like that? Do I like the way I'm talking to myself? Do I like the kind of person I am becoming? And if not, if I think there are weaknesses or problems, fix them. Don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of saying, yeah, I'm not yet anyway, the kind of person that I really want to be. I've got to strive to be that kind of person, and I'm not there yet. He says, crucial to developing virtue is having that openness to the fact that you aren't there yet. You may well need to change who you are, to give up certain faults, and to try to aspire to and develop strengths that you don't yet have. Well, one other really important point. Confucius says the superior person knows the way, the Tao, the right way to live. And without that knowledge, virtues can easily change into their opposites. I mentioned in the other video on Confucius on virtue that virtues are means between extremes. Sincerity, humility, other virtues, whether we exhibit them to ourselves or whether we exhibit them toward others, those are things that are means between extremes. And they occur at different levels. There are virtues of thought, virtues that primarily pertain to how I think about things. Sincerity and humility are crucial there. I've got to be willing to be open and honest with myself. I've got to have the right kind of opinion of myself and not too high an opinion of myself. Those are really happening at the level of me and at the level of my thinking. Then there are virtues of feeling. The superior person not only knows the way and does the right thing, but loves the way, does the right thing because it's right, likes being the right kind of person. You've not only got to do the right thing, you've got to want to do it. The ideal here is to strive to like being a good person, not to force yourself into being a good person, but to enjoy it, to like it, to love it. So Confucius says, at 15, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear obeyed truth. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was right. In other words, he's saying it took me 70 years to develop from the kind of person who wanted to be a good person to the point where actually my feelings and my actions and my thinking were all lined up together, where I actually felt what I'm supposed to feel, and that led me to do what I'm supposed to do. So I've got to think about things the way I ought to think about them. If I do, I'll feel the right kind of way about things, and if I feel the right way, if I react to situations in the right way, I'll do the right thing. So virtues of feeling, built on virtues of thinking, are crucial to develop virtues of action. Those without virtue can't abide long in a condition of poverty or hardship or in a condition of enjoyment. The virtuous are at ease with virtue. The wise desire virtue. Those who know the way aren't equal to those who love it. Those who love it aren't equal to those who delight in it. Well, how do we attain these virtues of thought, feeling, and action? we follow the rules of propriety. Here is a fundamental connection between those different questions of ethics. If we follow the rules of propriety, we start thinking about things in the right way. Then we start feeling the right way. And then we start doing the right thing automatically, as it were. And then we start enjoying behaving that way. So at the root of the virtues of the self, virtues of action rest on virtues of feeling, virtues of thought, and then that ultimate root, knowledge, actually knowing what's appropriate in various situations. So remember we said those fundamental virtues are means between extremes for Confucius. He talks about, in the Doctrine of the Mean, the golden mean, the question of getting things right as opposed to having too little or too much. You might say, being frivolous, too little seriousness. Being somber, that's too much. You've got to get it in between. But that raises a crucial question. How do we draw the line? How do we distinguish what's too little from the right amount and then too much? How do we know, in response to someone else in need, for example, what's stingy, what's generous, what's profligate? Well, we've got to draw the line there and decide what's the right amount of help to give. And that requires knowledge. So in the end, it's knowledge that distinguishes virtue from the competing vices. We've got to know what's appropriate. We've got to know what the right thing to do is. Well, how do we gain that without the virtue? You might think there's a big circle here in which everything depends on everything else. And Confucius would say, in a sense, that's right. We develop those virtues by figuring out what the right thing is to do, by making mistakes, by realizing, wait, gosh, I was a bit selfish there. I didn't do enough. Or in this case, I did too much. I actually spoiled that child. Or I, got that friend dependent on me in a way that's not really healthy or good for them, ultimately. And so we learn through experience where those boundaries are. And we develop that practical knowledge that enables us to distinguish too little from too much from the right amount. And in that way, develop virtues out of those opposites.